It all started with an empty seat on a crowded bus. An arrogant man, confident in his strength and the intimidating gaze he used to command attention, decided to humiliate the passenger next to him. A quiet, reserved, almost too calm fellow. He hurled insults, shoved him, and delivered a final threat that made several people laugh. What he didn't know was that this man was Steven Seagal. 60 seconds later, the bully who thought he owned the bus was trembling, his breath ragged, his hands clasped together, begging for forgiveness while everyone watched in astonishment. The rain fell on Seattle with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if the city were trying to wash away the sins that had accumulated in its alleyways. The skyscrapers reflected unlit lights, and the footsteps of passers-by echoed on the wet pavement. It was a restless morning, full of hurried activity and tense silences. The kind of day that could pass unnoticed or become a story remembered by anyone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. At a bus stop near the intersection of Olive Y and Minor Avenue, a man stood slightly apart from the other passengers. He wore a dark coat, boots worn smooth by years of precise use, and black gloves that served a purpose, not fashion. He wasn't just any man. He was Steven Seagal, a retired instructor, a former agent with a record as silent as it was lethal. No badges, no titles, no visible medals, just a life marked by discipline and an iron moral code. Steven had learned long ago that violence rarely began with shouts. It began with looks, with gestures, with small humiliations that most ignored. That's why his posture was so important. Upright, yet relaxed. Firm, yet not defiant. He observed the world with the serenity of a man who knew how to stop a storm before it became a hurricane. The bus arrived with a long sigh, exhaling warm smoke, opening its doors like a weary animal that must keep moving. The passengers boarded with resignation, each caught up in their own rhythm, their own small daily tragedies. Steven boarded last, nodded to the driver, and sat down in a side seat, letting the city unfold around him through the window. The bus interior was a mosaic of stories. An office worker trying to clean his fogged glasses, a young student sketching faces she perhaps regretted remembering, a Latino worker dozing off after an endless shift. Steven inhaled deeply. He still remembered why he was traveling that day. He was on his way to the ceremony honoring Mrs. Hamilton, a woman who had been more than a mentor in his youth. She had been the first person to see in Steven something more than strength. She saw purpose. She saw humanity. She saw a heart that still needed to learn to strike without breaking. Her teaching had saved him more times than he would admit. He would arrive at his tribute on time and in silence, as was fitting. The bus moved along through wet streets, the distant noise of traffic creating a constant, almost soothing background. But something changed when the driver stopped at the next stop. The door opened, and an elderly woman boarded with difficulty. Her hands trembled under the weight of 2 shopping bags, and her steps were as fragile as the leaves the wind tears from the trees. Her silver hair was neatly arranged. Although her body showed wear, there was dignity in her expression. Steven observed her for only a couple of seconds, but it was enough to recognize an urgent need. The woman was exhausted. She looked for an empty seat and found it, or thought she found it. In reality, the seat was occupied by the legs of a young man in his 20s who had claimed 2 spaces as if they belonged to him by divine right. He wore designer clothes, a thick chain, and an arrogant air. His headphones blasted music that everyone could hear. The old woman stopped next to him. Her voice, soft but firm. "Rose. Young man, would you mind if I sat down?" The young man didn't even look at her. He turned up the music, It was a rejection as simple as it was brutal. The passengers looked away, uncomfortable, cowardly. No one wanted to be the first to intervene. The old woman pressed her lips together, trying to keep her balance as the bus lurched. Stephen watched her silently. Civilization doesn't mean tall buildings, he thought. It means how we treat those who can't defend themselves. The woman tried again. Please, I just need this, old lady. Don't bother me. The young man blurted out, taking out an earbud. He said it with the insolence of someone who has never been stopped by anything or anyone. Some passengers sighed, others remained silent. The driver saw the conflict in the rearview mirror, but looked away. He didn't want any trouble. The tension thickened in the air like cold fog. And just then, the bus lurched as it hit a bump. The old woman lost her balance. One of her bags tilted. Her breathing became ragged. A paramedic sitting a few seats back immediately stood up to support her. Ma'am, you're very pale. You need to sit down now, he said urgently. That's not my problem, the young man warned without looking up. She paid her fare. I paid mine, and this seat is mine. The phrase cut through the air like a collective slap. Stephen placed his hands on his knees. His gaze hardened. The paramedic insisted. Young man, move. She might faint. What are you going to force me to do? The young man replied, smiling contemptuously. Who's going to do anything? You? Grandma? No one. No one did anything, except Stephen. He stood up with a slow, precise, measured movement. There was no defiance in his gaze, but there was absolute determination. He didn't speak. He walked toward the boy with the calm of a man who doesn't need to impose his presence. His shadow covered the seat. The young man looked up, annoyed, ready to verbally attack, but the words died in his mouth. There, standing, was a man whose stillness spoke louder than any shout, a man whose mere presence seemed to diminish the noise of the world. The story had begun. If you don't want to miss our content, hit the like button and subscribe below. Also, turn on notifications and tell us where you're listening from. We appreciate your support. The bus continued its slow advance down the avenue, stopping at every traffic light as if fate itself refused to ease the tension that hung in the air. The passengers continued murmuring among themselves, unable to tear their gaze away from the burly man who, minutes before, had humiliated Stephen Siegel without even understanding the magnitude of his mistake. The mixture of morbid curiosity, fear, and fascination was so palpable that it seemed as if there were a third passenger occupying each seat. Stephen sat silently, his back straight, his hands relaxed on his knees, his breathing so shallow it barely raised his chest. Anyone observing him closely might have sworn he was asleep. But those who truly knew him understood that this kind of stillness meant only one thing. He was observing, analyzing, measuring. And when Stephen Siegel measured something, it was always to act with surgical precision. The abuser, a broad, tattooed man with the smell of stale beer that seemed to permeate even the seats, had sat down without asking, shoving Stephen with his shoulder and then letting out an exaggerated laugh when he didn't react. So what? You're not going to say anything, Grandpa? He said, his tone a mixture of mockery and cheap bravado. Several passengers had held their breath, not out of fear that Stephen would respond, but out of fear of what would happen if he did. But Stephen said nothing. He simply looked up, and that was enough. A simple gesture, an instant, a look as precise as a knife's edge, a look that wordlessly communicated to the abuser that she had crossed an invisible line. Now, a minute after that violent initial encounter, the bus was moving forward, and the silence was almost absolute. The abuser, believing he had won, settled into his seat, opened another can of beer, and let the frothy liquid drip down his unkempt beard. "This is the life," he said loudly, banging the can against the metal bar of the seat in front of him. Several passengers watched him uncomfortably. An older woman clutched her purse as if she feared the noise of the can would herald another outburst of violence. A boy sitting with his mother further up couldn't stop looking behind him as if he knew something important was about to happen. Stephen, for his part, didn't react. His eyes remained half-closed, his breathing steady. But inside, a sequence of tactical calculations was unfolding. He noticed the way the bully moved his hands, how he distributed his weight in the seat, the slight clumsiness brought on by the alcohol. Every detail was a piece of the puzzle that would come together in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, the bus slammed on the brakes. A motorcycle had recklessly crossed the lane. The passengers shuddered. Some screamed. The bully lost his balance, and his half-empty can fell to the floor, spilling beer on the shoes of a woman who was standing. "Watch out, asshole!" she yelled. The bully stood up furiously, ready to pick a fight with anyone. And as if the universe were aligned with the lesson he was about to receive, he turned the wrong way, right toward Stephen. "You," he growled, "this is all your fault. If only you had kicked me out properly from the start." He didn't finish the sentence because Stephen stood up, not quickly, not violently, but with such absolute calm that it unsettled the entire bus. The guy took a step back involuntarily, as if his legs moved before his brain could control them. "I don't want any trouble," Stephen said in a low but firm voice. The bully let out a nervous laugh, trying to regain his supposed authority. "Now you want to talk? Well, too late, old man. I'm in charge here." The bus froze. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, trembling, unsure whether to stop or accelerate. Then a movement occurred, precise, elegant, lethal, only seemingly so, but measured to avoid unnecessary harm. Stephen grabbed the abuser's wrist with one hand, twisting it at an impossible angle, and simultaneously pushed his elbow down, forcing the man to bend until he was almost kneeling. The maneuver took less than a second. No one even blinked. The abuser let out a muffled cry, a mixture of surprise and pain. "Let go of me, let go of me. Help, he's going to break my arm." The contrast was brutal. Minutes earlier, he had humiliated Stephen, believing that the lack of reaction was a sign of weakness. Now, in less time than it takes to blink, he was kneeling, trembling, his breath ragged, his voice cracking with fear. "I'm not going to break anything," Stephen said, maintaining the minimum pressure necessary to control the joint. "But you need calm down. You're bothering everyone here." The passengers watched the scene with a mixture of relief and fascination. Some smiled discreetly. The woman whose purse had been splashed with beer murmured, "Finally." The bully, unable to escape her grasp, began to plead, "Please, please, I didn't know who you were." Stephen tilted his head only slightly. "You didn't have to know," he replied calmly. "You just had to respect others." The silence was absolute. The entire bus seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Stephen released the bully's wrist, who recoiled as if he'd just escaped a hungry lion. He rubbed his trembling arm and, without another word, shrank to the farthest seat possible, cowering like a scolded child. A woman 2 seats away began to clap. Others joined in. The driver smiled with relief. Stephen, not seeking recognition, simply sat back down. Calm breathing, serene gaze, as if nothing had happened. But everyone knew something had changed, because for a minute, the entire bus had witnessed the lion's breathing. The bus now moved forward in an eerie, almost reverential silence. The passengers seemed unable to resume the conversations that had previously filled the space. It was as if the air itself had shifted in weight after what they had just witnessed. No one wanted to break the stillness. No one wanted to attract the attention of the man who, with a single movement, had reduced the loudest bully on the bus to a bundle of pleas. Steven Seagal remained seated in the same spot, with the serenity of someone who had long ago learned to live with violence without letting it define him. His posture was so relaxed that anyone would think absolutely nothing had happened. But his eyes, though calm, remained attentive to the reflections in the windows, the movements of the passengers, the rhythm of the engine vibrating beneath everyone's feet. Despite his outward composure, Steven knew the incident wasn't over. There was something more, something stirring among the muffled murmurs, denser than the tension and darker than the fear they had experienced so far. The abuser, the tattooed man who just moments before had thought he was in control, sat at the back of the bus, breathing raggedly. His eyes were red, not from pain, but from the toxic mix of shame and rage seething inside him. He couldn't accept that he had been humiliated in front of so many people. Even less could he accept that he had begged. That kind of man never forgave something like that. And worse, he never left him alone. While the passengers began to relax, at least a little, Steven kept his attention focused on the back of the bus without even turning his head. The abuser moved his hand slowly toward his right pocket. Not obviously, not aggressively, but with the subtlety of someone who has already decided on his next move. Steven exhaled through his nose, a small, almost imperceptible sigh. Not again, thought a woman sitting near the abuser. She saw him rummaging in his pocket and tensed immediately. She huddled against the window, fearing he would pull out something dangerous. The man noticed the reaction, smiled a crooked smirk, and muttered something inaudible but clearly threatening. The driver, seeing the passenger's unease, spoke into the intercom, his voice trembling. "Sir, please, stay calm. We're almost at the next stop." But the bully didn't even listen. He still had his hand hidden, his breathing faster, trembling not from fear, but from a wounded ego. Steven finally opened his eyes completely. He didn't turn around, didn't stand up, didn't assume a fighting stance. He just spoke. "If you do what you're thinking," he said firmly, without raising his voice, "you're going to hurt yourself a lot more than you already are." The whole bus froze. The bully froze, his hand still in his pocket. "What? What's he saying?" A passenger up front stammered. "I'm warning you one last time," Steven continued. "Don't do it." The tone wasn't aggressive, it wasn't overbearing, it didn't contain a single drop of threat. It was a warning, a fact, as if Steven were describing an inevitable event. The bully, feeling exposed, roared, "Don't tell me what to do." And in an instant, he pulled a small folding knife from his pocket, no bigger than the palm of a hand, but sharp enough to cause real harm. Several people screamed. A young woman covered her mouth with her hands. A man tried to stand to intervene, but the woman next to him stopped him. Steven stood with a movement that seemed to defy gravity and the tension of the moment. It was a floating rise, effortless, unhurried. He didn't turn around immediately, he just spoke. "You're going to regret this." The abuser, fueled by adrenaline, took 2 clumsy steps forward, gripping the knife in his right hand. The bus was still moving. Calabash made the weapon tremble dangerously. "Should I cut him to pieces?" he shouted, spitting saliva. Steven finally turned his torso, just enough to see him out of the corner of his eye. "The problem isn't what you're holding," he said. "The problem is that you don't know how to use it." The sentence provoked a collective murmur. Feeling challenged, the assailant moved faster. But in his haste, he forgot the bus was still moving. A slight jolt of the brakes threw him off balance, and that mistake was all Stephen needed. In the blink of an eye, Stephen closed the distance between them without walking. He seemed to glide. He grabbed the assailant's wrist, twisted the knife outward, and applied a twisting motion that forced the man to drop the weapon. The sound of metal hitting the ground echoed like thunder. The assailant fell to his knees again, this time not from physical pain, but because Stephen had overpowered him before he could even understand how Stephen hadn't punched him, hadn't thrown him, hadn't hurt him more than necessary. He had simply immobilized him with a technique so precise it seemed choreographed. "That's enough," Stephen said softly. "You'll end up dead if you keep doing this." The assailant swallowed hard, his eyes filled with tears, but not the tears of a physically injured man, but rather those of someone who finally understood the magnitude of the abyss into which she was falling. "Please," she whispered. "No more. I don't want any more trouble. Please let me go." It was the second time he begged, and this time his soul was broken. Stephen released him, but didn't walk away immediately. He looked at him for just a second long enough for the abuser to understand that he had found the true limit and crossed it twice. The driver finally stopped the bus at the next stop, breathing a sigh of relief. "Sir," he said, looking at the abuser, "you get off here." The man didn't argue, didn't protest. He simply stood up, head bowed, and stepped off the bus, his hands trembling. As the door closed, the passengers erupted in applause. Not out of morbid curiosity, not because of violence, but because they had seen something rare. Justice with restraint, strength without cruelty. Stephen returned to his seat. He didn't seek recognition, didn't seek anyone's gaze. He just murmured as if talking to himself. "I hope he learns." But unbeknownst to him, the day had only just begun, and his real problem wasn't that man, but what was waiting for him further ahead. The bus resumed its route after the abuser got off, leaving behind a trail of tension that gradually dissipated. The passengers began to talk again, but this time in low, almost respectful tones, as if afraid of disturbing the balance that Stephen Siegel had unwittingly established. Every now and then, glances turned toward him, some filled with gratitude, others with astonishment, and a few with simple curiosity. But Stephen remained the same as always, serene, motionless, with half-closed eyes and deep breathing. It seemed as if his mind wasn't still inside the bus, but somewhere farther away, perhaps quieter, where the everyday violence of the streets didn't exist. Meanwhile, the driver, his hands still trembling, kept looking at Stephen in the rearview mirror. He didn't know whether to thank him or apologize for not having intervened. Finally, he chose to remain silent. It was clear that the man wasn't seeking recognition, and any inappropriate comment would only make him uncomfortable. However, at the back of the bus, a different shadow it was beginning to materialize. A thin young man, wearing a black jacket far too big for him, looked up from his phone. His eyes followed Stephen's figure with an interest unlike that of an ordinary passenger. He wasn't amazed, grateful, or curious. He was analyzing, calculating, deciding. The young man hadn't reacted during the confrontation with the abuser. He hadn't screamed or moved, as if violence were so commonplace to him that it didn't even trigger an internal alarm. His tattooed fingers drummed against his leg with a disturbing rhythm. There was something about him that set him apart from the rest of the passengers, a coldness that only appears when someone becomes too accustomed to a dangerous world. That guy moves like the old-timers at the dojo, the boy whispered to himself. But he doesn't seem like one of the big shots, does he? His eyes never left Stephen. At the next stop, several people got off, freeing up space on the bus. Stephen moved a few inches to let a woman carrying shopping bags pass. It was a simple, almost automatic gesture, but enough to make the boy smile maliciously. Yeah, he definitely knows what he's doing, he thought. But he's confident, too confident. The bus continued its journey toward one of the neighborhoods where the streets became narrower and the shops older. The passengers began to dwindle. The sun was starting to set behind the buildings, casting long shadows on the pavement. Stephen felt a subtle unease then. It wasn't physical. It wasn't visible. It was the particular feeling of someone who has spent years training to sense danger even before it appears. An internal vibration, a shift in the atmosphere, a glance, an intention. Stephen opened his eyes fully. They were no longer the calm eyes he'd worn throughout the journey. Now they were alert, focused, like those of an animal that had sensed something out of place. He turned his head only slightly, and there he was, the boy in the black jacket. The way he was observing him wasn't that of someone surprised or curious. It was that of a predator recognizing another predator. The boy smiled, and that smile held no friendship. "So you noticed," he murmured. Stephen didn't answer. He just held the gaze. There was no hostility in his eyes, but there was a silent warning. "Don't go down that road." The boy stood up just as the bus stopped at another stop. Several passengers got off. The vehicle became emptier, quieter, more dangerous. The boy took advantage of the empty space to move a few seats closer to Stephen. His gait had the rhythm of someone who knows his own power. He wasn't clumsy like the bully from before. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't loud. He was meticulous. The driver noticed the movement and frowned. He watched him in the rearview mirror, uneasy. He'd seen that kind of behavior many times in unruly passengers. A false calm that foreshadowed a storm. The boy sat down 2 seats away, far enough away not to seem provocative, yet far enough away to strike if the opportunity arose. "What you did was classy," he said quietly, without taking his eyes off Stephen. "That guy was a clown. He deserved it." Stephen didn't reply. The boy continued. "But you're not just any guy. I saw you move your wrists, twist the joint. You were well trained." "I don't go looking for trouble," Stephen said finally, his voice firm. The boy chuckled softly. "Trouble comes looking for you. It's obvious. You attract them." The bus turned onto a darker street. Neon lights reflected in the windows. The driver, uncomfortable, accelerated a little more than usual. Stephen barely turned his face toward the boy. "You don't have to follow me." "Follow you?" he replied, surprised. "No, I'm not following you, but I want to know something." He leaned forward. "Who taught you to move like that?" Stephen remained silent. The boy thought that was answer enough. "I see. It's in your blood. I train too. But out there," he pointed to the window, "you train differently. Without rules, without teachers." The tone wasn't threatening, but it wasn't innocent either. The driver suddenly intervened. "Friends, if you can, don't speak so loudly. It's late, and this neighborhood isn't safe." The boy smiled without looking at the driver. "I know," he replied. "That's why I want to end this here." Stephen's jaw tightened. He knew what was coming. His intuition didn't fail him. The boy stood up slowly. His hands were relaxed, but there was a dangerous spark in his eyes. He wasn't just any criminal. He wasn't impulsive. He was a young man with skill, discipline, and a touch of darkness. "Show me," he said. "I just want to see if you're as good as you seem." The driver slammed on the brakes. "Hey, no fighting here. Get off if you're going to do anything crazy." But it was too late. Stephen stood up. Their eyes met in a silence that seemed to split the air in two. There were no shouts, no threats, just two paths destined to cross. The boy took a step forward. Stephen took a deep breath, and then the bus lurched violently, forcing them both to react. The real storm was about to begin. The station corridor was enveloped in an eerie silence, one that didn't stem from immediate fear, but from a collective understanding. Something was about to happen. Stephen Siegel moved forward with slow, measured steps, while behind him lingered the echo of what had happened on the bus. The passengers who had gotten off with him continued to watch him with respect, some even with a mixture of awe and relief, as if Stephen's mere presence held back the chaos. But Stephen wasn't interested in the silent applause or the admiring glances. His mind was elsewhere, on what he had seen in the eyes of the abuser shook him when he immobilized him a second time. That trembling wasn't just fear. It was suppressed rage. It was the kind of ego that wouldn't be extinguished by a brief lesson, but would burn and transform into revenge. And that revenge, he knew, wouldn't come alone. The station was half empty, illuminated by fluorescent lights that flickered with a persistent hum. A perfect place for darkness to move unseen. Stephen walked over to a vending machine. Not because he needed a drink, but because from that vantage point, he could observe almost all the entrances, stairwells, side corridors, the main entrance, and the maintenance area. He stood there motionless, listening. His ears first picked up what his eyes later confirmed. The dry echo of heavy footsteps, several pairs, advancing with intentions that required no explanation. "I knew it wouldn't be that easy," Stephen muttered to himself. 3 men appeared from the front door. They were bigger than the bus bully and moved with the confidence of those who had fought before and enjoyed doing so. They wore leather jackets, heavy boots, and chains dangling from their pockets. One of them had a tattoo identical to the one Stephen had seen on the bully's arm. Family or friends, maybe more. The one in the middle smirked. "You're Stephen Siegel," he said, pronouncing the name as if spitting venom. Stephen didn't reply. There was no need. "My brother came home crying," the man continued, taking a step forward. "He said some old guy with a ponytail made him look like a coward in front of a bus full of people." The words hung for a moment, heavy with resentment and a threat as obvious as it was unnecessary. "It's not my fault if your brother doesn't know how to behave," Stephen replied, his voice unchanged. The leader frowned, then smiled a thin, dangerous smile. "Well, today you're going to learn what happens when you humiliate someone." To the wrong family. The other two moved to the sides, surrounding him. It was a deliberate formation designed to cut off any escape route. But what they didn't understand, what they would never understand, was that Stephen didn't need to escape. He never did. "I'm only going to say this once," Stephen said calmly. "Stand back. I don't want to hurt anyone." The 3 men began to laugh, a deep, mocking laugh that echoed through the deserted hallway. "Did you hear that?" one of them sneered. "The martial artist is giving us a chance." "What a joke." Stephen sighed, not from fear, but from disappointment. He knew they wouldn't listen. The first attacker, the one on the right, charged at him with a straight punch, looking to knock him out in one blow. He was strong, too strong, but also too slow. Stephen twisted his torso slightly, dodging, and with a sharp slap, he brought the attacker's elbow down. The man grunted, clutching his arm as Stephen pushed him with a minimal throw that slammed him against the wall. The second attacker didn't wait. He lunged from the left, trying to grab Stephen by the waist to pull him to the ground, but Stephen lowered his center of gravity, caught the man's wrist, and spun with surgical precision, driving his shoulder into the attacker's chest. The impact left the second man breathless, falling to his knees. Only the leader remained, and he didn't hold back. He pulled out a thick chain coiled around his forearm and cracked it like a whip. Metallic. "Now then, old man," he growled. "I'm gonna smash your face in." Stephen took a step back, not out of fear, by calculation. The leader launched the first lash. The sound of the chain slicing through the air was so aggressive, it made his muscles vibrate. Stephen tilted his head just inches and let the chain whiz past his ear. The attacker spun, bracing for the next blow, and then Stephen acted. Taking advantage of the man's turn, Stephen caught the chain mid-flight, blocking it with his forearm, protected by his own clothing. The attacker's eyes widened in surprise. Before he could regain his composure, Stephen yanked the chain closer. The leader lost his balance, and Stephen met him with a lever strike to the shoulder that forced him to drop the weapon. The chain fell to the ground with a metallic clang that echoed through the empty station. The leader, now without his weapon, took a couple of steps back. His eyes showed something that hadn't been there before. Legitimate fear. "No, it can't be," he murmured. Stephen took a step forward, just one. But it was enough for the leader to understand that he had already lost. "Your brother made a mistake," Stephen said firmly, "and you're about to repeat it." The other two men, still dazed, tried to get up. The leader glanced at them, then at Stephen, and made the most sensible decision he'd made all day. "Let's go," he ordered. They turned and ran down the corridor, disappearing into the distance. Stephen stood there breathing calmly, but his mind was not at ease. If three had come, it meant there was someone else behind them, someone who sought not just revenge, but a final rematch. And Stephen knew exactly who it was. The station seemed even quieter after the three men fled down the corridor. The echo of their boots, now distant, vanished as if the building itself had swallowed them whole. Even though the immediate threat had passed, Stephen Siegel knew this wasn't the end. It was merely an interlude, a brief calm before the real storm arrived. Stephen took a deep breath, studying his reflection in the dark glass of a display case. He could see the tension in his jaw, though his face remained serene. The bus incident, the attack at the station, none of it had happened by chance. It was a chain reaction triggered by a single mistake, allowing that abuser to get too close, and only one link was missing. In the distance, a metallic sound echoed on the station floor. It wasn't the hurried footsteps of cowardly criminals. It was something heavier, more steady. Firm steps, confident steps, the steps of someone who no longer came to intimidate, but to decide. Stephen turned slowly from the end of the corridor. A figure emerged from the shadows, cast by the faulty lighting on the walls. He was tall, burly, wearing a leather jacket that looked like it had seen decades of fights, and his face was hardened by experiences that couldn't be spoken aloud. His gaze was intense, the kind of thing that pierces a man without words. And even without knowing him, Stephen recognized him. Because that was the kind of person who only appears once in a story. The real problem, the older brother, the true leader. The man stopped about 10 meters away. "My name doesn't matter," he said in a deep voice that boomed like thunder. "What matters is what you did." Stephen narrowed his eyes. "Your brother was out of control. I restored order. Nothing more." The man took 2 steps forward, unhurried. His shadow stretched out before him, long like a stain that seemed to want to devour the ground. "My brother came home crying," he said, "crying like a child. I can tolerate many things, Steven Seagal, but I can't tolerate seeing my family on their knees." Steven didn't answer. There were no words that could change the course of what was about to happen. "I know who you are," the man continued. "I've heard stories that sound like legends, stories that make cowards tremble and brave men smile." He paused, a barely perceptible smile forming on his face. "So I decided to come myself." Steven stepped forward. "You don't have to fight," he said. "Relax. No one was hurt. Your brother is alive. You can still put this behind you." The man laughed, a short, thick laugh, laced with a mixture of respect and defiance. "That's the problem, Seagull. Sometimes men don't come looking for victory, they come looking for closure." And then, with a surprisingly swift movement for his size, he took off his jacket, letting it fall to the floor. His arms, marked by old scars, tensed like steel cables. "I'm not armed," he said. "I don't need to. And I don't want you to use any pain techniques either. Just you and me. Fists, nothing else." It was an honest challenge, a fight that didn't seek an advantage, only truth. Steven understood and accepted. He took his stance, feet firmly planted, hands relaxed, and his gaze fixed on the center of his opponent's chest. The air in the station shifted. It grew denser, heavier, as if even the building itself awaited the clash. The man struck first, a straight, powerful punch aimed at Steven's face. But Steven deflected the blow with his forearm and pivoted to absorb the force of the impact. The attacker didn't stop. He threw a second, lower punch, this time targeting the abdomen. Steven blocked again, this time with an open palm. The exchange intensified. Punches that sliced through the air, precise blocks, blows that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ground. The opponent was strong, incredibly strong. Every punch he threw carried a clear intention: to knock out, to break, to dominate. And yet, Steven didn't back down. His movements were fluid, almost artistic, as if his body knew exactly where to position itself before the violence reached it. After a minute of intense fighting, both men stopped, breathing heavily. The leader smiled. "Now I understand," he said, "why my brother didn't stand a chance." Steven didn't smile. He was focused. And then the leader threw his most brutal punch, a right hook that would have shattered the jaw of any ordinary man. But Steven tilted his head and, using the momentum of the missed punch, pushed the attacker forward, knocking him off balance. The man tried to regain his footing, but Steven was already on top of him. Not to strike, but to immobilize him. Steven used the attacker's own weight to take him down with a roundhouse throw. The leader hit the ground with a thud, but before he could react, Steven placed a knee on his chest and a hand on his shoulder, pinning him to the ground without hurting him more than necessary. The man tried to break free. He failed. He tried a second time. He failed again and finally gave up. "Enough," he said hoarsely. "I understand." Steven released him immediately. He didn't need to humiliate him. He stood and helped him to his feet, offering him a hand. The leader accepted it with difficulty, surprised by the gesture. "Your brother is alive because I let him live," Steven said. "And you too?" The man took a deep breath. For the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only respect. "You're better than they say," he admitted. Steven nodded without pride. "We all have to choose who we want to be." The leader picked up his jacket, cast one last look at Steven, and turned away. "This ends here," he declared. He walked down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows, leaving behind the resentment and leaving Stephen alone in the vast, silent station. Stephen left slowly, with the tranquility of someone who doesn't seek violence, but stops it when it appears. He knew that life would continue to test him. He knew there would always be another conflict, another injustice, another situation where someone needed help. But he also knew something else. As long as there were people like that abuser, as long as there was arrogance that despised the weak, as long as injustice walked free, Stephen Siegel would always be there to restore order, to teach, to stop, to remind everyone that sometimes a minute is enough for the one who humiliates to be the one begging. No. Stephen placed a knee on the man's chest and a hand on his shoulder, pinning him to the ground without hurting him more than necessary. The man tried to break free. He failed. He tried a second time. He failed again and finally gave up. Enough, he said hoarsely. I understand. Stephen released him immediately. He didn't need to humiliate him. He stood and helped him to his feet, offering him a hand. The leader took it with difficulty, surprised by the gesture. Your brother is alive because I let him live, Stephen said. And so are you? The man took a deep breath. For the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only respect. You're better than they say, he admitted. Stephen nodded without pride. We all have to choose who we want to be. The leader picked up his jacket, cast one last look at Stephen, and turned away. This ends here, he declared. He walked down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows, leaving behind the resentment and leaving Stephen alone in the vast, silent station. Stephen left slowly, with the calm of someone who doesn't seek violence, but stops it when it appears. He knew life would continue to test him. He knew there would always be another conflict, another injustice, another situation where someone needed help. But he also knew something else. As long as there were people like that abuser, as long as there was arrogance that despised the weak, as long as injustice walked free, Stephen Siegel would always be there to restore order, to teach, to stop, to remind everyone that sometimes a minute is enough for the one who humiliates to be the one who ends up begging. No. Stephen placed a knee on the man's chest and a hand on his shoulder, pinning him to the ground without hurting him more than necessary. The man tried to break free. He failed. He tried a second time. He failed again and finally gave up. Enough, he said hoarsely. I understand. Stephen released him immediately. He didn't need to humiliate him. He stood and helped him to his feet, offering him a hand. The leader took it with difficulty, surprised by the gesture. Your brother is alive because I let him live, Stephen said. And so are you? The man took a deep breath. For the first time, there was no anger in his eyes, only respect. You're better than they say, he admitted. Stephen nodded without pride. We all have to choose who we want to be. The leader picked up his jacket, cast one last look at Stephen, and turned away. This ends here, he declared. He walked down the corridor, disappearing into the shadows, leaving behind the resentment and leaving Stephen alone in the vast, silent station. Stephen left slowly, with the calm of someone who doesn't seek violence, but stops it when it appears. He knew life would continue to test him. He knew there would always be another conflict, another injustice, another situation where someone needed help. But he also knew something else. As long as there were people like that abuser, as long as there was arrogance that despised the weak, as long as injustice walked free, Stephen Siegel would always be there to restore order, to teach, to stop, To remind everyone that sometimes a minute is enough for the one who humiliates to be the one who ends up begging. No. As long as injustice roamed free, Steven Seagal would always be there to restore order, to teach, to stop it, to remind everyone that sometimes a minute is enough for the one who humiliates to be the one begging. No. As long as injustice roamed free, Steven Seagal would always be there to restore order, to teach, to stop it, to remind everyone that sometimes a minute is enough for the one who humiliates to be the one begging. No.